The following is a personal account recorded by Sheriff Marcus Webb of Whitefall, Alaska, discovered among his belongings after his disappearance in January 2024. This recording was found sealed in Evidence Locker 17, along with photographs and documents that have yet to be explained. My name is Sheriff Marcus Webb. If you're hearing this, then something's happened to me, something I should have seen coming. I've been Sheriff of Whitefall for 12 years. Population 347. Make that 323 now. 24 people don't just vanish into thin air, not even in Alaska, but they did. The first disappearance happened on November 15th. Sarah Chen, 32, elementary school teacher, found her car running outside the grocery store. Door open, purse still inside, no tracks in the snow leading away. Nothing. The second was 3 days later. Jim Morrison, the postmaster, same story. Truck running, door open, like he just stepped out for a moment and never came back. By December 1st, we'd lost 6 people, all adults, all taken the same way. The state boys came down from Anchorage, set up their fancy equipment, interviewed everyone twice, found nothing, said it was probably a serial killer passing through, told us to lock our doors and wait it out. But I knew better. I'd lived in Whitefall my whole life. Born here, went to school here, came back after the army. I knew this place like my own heartbeat, and I knew something was hunting us. The polar night started early this year. November 10th, the sun set for the last time, until late January. 67 days of darkness. That's when they started disappearing faster. The darkness seemed to give whatever was stalking us more confidence, more opportunity. By December 15th, 8 people had vanished without a trace. The pattern was becoming clear, but nobody wanted to acknowledge what we were really dealing with. The truth was too terrifying to accept. The call came at 3:17 in the morning. Dispatch radio crackling with static that seemed to carry whispers in the white noise. Sheriff Webb, we got another one. I already knew who it was before Deputy Martinez told me. Glenn Hawkins, 54, ran the hardware store. Same pattern. Truck running outside his house, keys in the ignition, door hanging open, like he'd heard something irresistible and went to investigate. I stood in the snow beside Glenn's pickup, flashlight beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. The temperature was minus 23 degrees. In this cold, you don't leave your vehicle running with the door open, not unless something compels you to, leading from the house to the truck. Then they just stop. I knelt beside the driver's side door, snow crunching under my knees. Glenn's coffee mug sat in the cup holder, still steaming. The ceramic was warm to the touch. Whatever took him had acted with terrifying speed and precision. Sheriff Martinez's voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. She pointed to something in the snow with her flashlight. What's that? I moved my beam to where she indicated. There, pressed deep into the snow beside the truck, was a print that made my blood freeze. It was vaguely human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Longer, narrower than any human foot. The toes tapered to sharp points, and at the tips were unmistakable claw marks, gouged into the frozen earth beneath. Could be a wolf, Martinez said, but her voice carried no conviction whatsoever. I'd tracked wolves my entire life. This wasn't a wolf. The print was nearly twice the size of the largest wolf track I'd ever seen, and wolves hunted in packs, left multiple trails. This was a solitary predator, something massive enough to overpower a grown man, without leaving any sign of struggle. I photographed the print from multiple angles, my camera flash briefly illuminating the surrounding darkness. Glenn made 9 disappearances, 9 people in less than 2 months. The state investigators had retreated to Anchorage after the 7th vanishing, claiming they'd return when weather conditions improved. They'd abandoned us to face whatever was systematically hunting our community. That night, I sat in my office surrounded by case files, the weight of responsibility crushing down on me. 9 people, all adults between 25 and 60, all taken during the endless night, though in December, darkness claimed nearly 24 hours of each day, all discovered the same way, vehicles running, doors open, no signs of violence or resistance. But as I studied the dates more carefully, a chilling pattern emerged that the state investigators had completely missed. The disappearances weren't random, they followed a precise schedule. Every 3 to 4 days, like clockwork, like something was feeding on a predetermined timetable. I pulled out my calendar and marked each disappearance with a red X. If the pattern held true, the next victim would be taken tomorrow night. The question that haunted me was simple yet terrifying. Who would it choose? I spent the gray morning hours at the Whitefall Historical Society, a cramped one-room building that smelled of old paper and forgotten secrets. Miss Kowalski, the librarian, had been the keeper of our town's history for 4 decades. If anyone understood what was happening to us, it would be her. 9 disappearances, you said. She adjusted her thick glasses, studying the list I'd compiled with trembling finger. This reminds me of something from long ago. Before your time, Sheriff. She led me to a dusty file cabinet tucked into the darkest corner of the room. The metal drawer protested with a rusty screech as she pulled it open. Outside the frost-covered windows, the darkness was absolute despite being noon. Winter of 1973, she whispered, extracting a manila folder that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Similar incidents, people vanishing into thin air, always during the darkest hours, always without explanation. The folder contained yellowed newspaper clippings from the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. Headlines screamed about the Whitefall mystery and the vanishing residents. 7 people had disappeared over 6 brutal weeks during that winter. Then, as suddenly as it began, the nightmare ended. What stopped it? I asked, dreading the answer. Mrs. Kowalski's face grew pale, her eyes distant with ancient fear. The official story was that people got lost in blizzard. The authorities promised bodies would surface when the snow melted in spring. I read through the articles with growing unease. According to the reports, no bodies were ever recovered. 7 people had simply ceased to exist. Sheriff Webb, Miss Kowalski said in a voice barely above a whisper. There's something else, something the newspapers never printed. She glanced toward the windows, as if expecting to see something watching us, then leaned closer. My grandmother shared stories with me, native stories from before Whitefall was even founded. She said this area was forbidden territory, cursed hunting grounds. Something ancient lived in these woods, something that grew ravenous when winter's grip tightened. What kind of something? My mouth felt dry as dust. She called it the hunger that walks, described it as human-shaped, but impossibly tall and thin, eyes like winter storms and teeth like shattered ice. When natural prey became scarce, it would claim what it needed to survive. I'd heard countless native legends during my years in Alaska. Most were metaphorical warnings about natural dangers, bears, wolves, avalanches, exposure. But something about this description sent ice through my veins. Did she know how to stop it? Mrs. Kowalski shook her head slowly, her expression gray. She said you couldn't kill something that was never truly alive. You could only wait for spring to drive it back into dormancy. I left the Historical Society carrying photocopies of the 1973 files, and a growing certainty that our situation was far worse than anyone imagined. The disappearances weren't recent phenomena. They were part of a cycle that repeated every few decades when conditions became desperate enough. That evening, I drove through Whitefall's empty streets, checking on the remaining residents. The town felt different now, smaller, more vulnerable. The few people I encountered moved with quick, nervous steps, constantly checking shadows, as if they could feel predatory eyes watching their every movement. At 8:15 precisely, my radio crackled to life with the call I'd been expecting and dreading. Sheriff, it's happened again. Linda Hayes, 41, head nurse at our small medical clinic. We found her outside the building where she'd worked for 15 years. Her car running, driver's door standing open like a mouth screaming into the darkness. But this time, I'd spent the previous afternoon installing motion-activated trail cameras throughout the town. If something was systematically hunting our people, I intended to document it. The camera positioned near the clinic had triggered at 7:50. I reviewed the footage on my phone while Martinez secured the scene, her movements sharp with nervous energy. The video showed Linda completing her evening shift, walking briskly to her car through the swirling snow.
She unlocked the door, slid behind the wheel, started the engine. Then something changed. Her posture stiffened. Her head turned slowly towards something beyond the camera's field of view. She stepped out of the car like a sleepwalker, her movements eerily smooth and purposeful. She walked toward the edge of the frame with the mechanical precision of someone no longer in control of their actions. Then the camera feed dissolved into static. "Did you see that?" Martinez asked, looking over my shoulder at the small screen. "See what specifically?" Right before the interference started, there was something else in the frame, something that didn't belong. I rewound the footage and studied it frame by frame. She was correct. For just a moment, at the very edge of the image, a shadow moved. It appeared human but fundamentally wrong. Too tall, too angular. When Linda walked toward it, she moved like someone in a trance. I uploaded the footage and sent it to a digital forensics expert in Anchorage. His return call came within the hour, his voice tight with confusion. "Sheriff Webb, this is unprecedented. The static isn't random electromagnetic interference. It's patterned, almost like a signal designed to disrupt recording equipment." "What about the shadow figure?" "That's where things get truly bizarre. I've enhanced the image as much as possible. I'm sending you the results now." The enhanced photograph arrived on my phone moments later. The shadow was clearer now, though clarity only made it more disturbing. It definitely had a humanoid shape, but the proportions were nightmarishly wrong. The limbs were grotesquely elongated, the fingers extended into what appeared to be claws, and the face was an empty void. No features, no definition, just a hollow darkness, where human characteristics should exist. I showed the image to Martinez. The color drained from her cheeks. "What in God's name is that thing?" I didn't answer because understanding was beginning to crystallize in my mind. The native stories Mrs. Kowalski had shared, the cyclical nature of the disappearances, the way victims walked willingly toward their captor. We weren't dealing with a human predator. We were confronting something that had no right to exist, something that had been stalking these woods for generations, perhaps centuries. Something that was growing bolder with each successful hunt. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, that shadow figure haunted my vision. Those impossible proportions, that featureless void where a face should be. At 4 in the morning, I abandoned any pretense of rest and returned to the station. I spread every case file across my desk, determined to find connections the previous investigators had made. Age demographics. All victims were adults between 25 and 60. No children, no elderly residents. There had to be a reason. Geographic distribution scattered throughout town with no apparent clustering. The selection seemed random. Physical characteristics. Diverse group, including both men and women of varying builds and ethnicities. No obvious physical commonalities. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Working with Linda Hayes's medical access codes, I pulled health records for all recent victims. What I discovered confirmed my worst suspicions. Every single person taken had been dealing with chronic health issues. Sarah Chen had type 2 diabetes. Jim Morrison struggled with hypertension. Glenn Hawkins had been fighting lung cancer. These weren't random selections. They were deliberate choices. Something was specifically targeting the most vulnerable members of our community. I called Mrs. Kowalski at home, startling her from sleep. "The native stories your grandmother told," I said without preamble. "Did she ever explain why this thing chose specific victims?" A long silence stretched across the phone line before she responded. She said it could sense weakness, that it preferred those who were already struggling, those whose absence might be more easily accepted by the community. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because I prayed I was wrong," she whispered. "Because if I'm right, then everyone in this town is in mortal danger." I ended the call and stared at the files spread before me. 10 victims across 2 separate time periods 50 years apart, all suffering from chronic conditions, all taken during the deepest, darkest part of winter. The most terrifying realization was that if this creature could detect illness, it probably knew about every vulnerable person remaining in Whitefall. It wasn't hunting randomly, it was working methodically through a predetermined list.
I accessed our medical database and cross-referenced chronic health conditions with our remaining population. 43 residents matched the victim profile. My hands shook as I realized I was among them. An IED explosion in Afghanistan had left me with chronic pain that I'd been managing with medication for years. My phone rang. Martinez's number flashing on the screen. Sheriff. Her voice was tight with terror. I think something's been watching my house. I found Martinez sitting in her patrol car, outside her apartment complex, engine running, shotgun resting across her knees. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the weapon. Tell me exactly what you observed, I said, sliding into the passenger seat. I was preparing for bed when I heard something outside. Footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too slow, too deliberate, like something was taking its time. She pointed toward her second-floor window. I looked out and saw a figure standing directly under the streetlight, just standing there, staring up at my window. Definitely human-shaped, humanish, but impossibly tall and thin. When I blinked, it had vanished completely. I scanned the empty street. Fresh snow had fallen since evening, obscuring any potential tracks or evidence. Martinez, I need to ask something personal. Have you had any medical issues recently? Any health concerns? She looked puzzled by the question. I had blood work done last month. Doctor said my iron levels were dangerously low, prescribed supplements, and dietary changes. Why? That confirmed my theory. The creature was systematically targeting anyone with health problems, regardless of severity. Pack essential belongings, I told her. You're staying at the station until we resolve this situation. What about my apartment? I looked up at her darkened window. If that thing had been surveilling her, it would return. We'll address that tomorrow. We spent the night at the station, alternating watch duties. Neither of us managed any real sleep. Every sound from outside made us reach for weapons. Every shadow seemed to shift and move with predatory intent. At dawn, which was merely a slightly lighter shade of darkness, I went to examine Martinez's apartment building. The story written in the snow around the structure made my hands shake. Tracks circled the entire building, human-shaped but fundamentally wrong. The stride length was impossibly long. The impressions were too deep, as if whatever made them carried far more weight than its appearance suggested. The tracks made 3 complete circuits, always remaining just outside the range of the security lighting. But the prints near the rear fire escape nearly stopped my heart. They led directly to Martinez's back door. Something had been testing the locks, probing for weaknesses, photographed and measured everything. The prints were nearly twice the length of my size. 11 boots, the toes terminated in distinct claw marks, scratched into the frozen ground. This wasn't a bear walking upright or any natural predator I'd ever encountered. I radioed Martinez immediately. Under no circumstances should you return to your apartment alone. Do you understand me? Her voice crackled back, strained with fear. Sheriff, we have a bigger problem. Mrs. Henderson just called. She says someone's been trying to break into her house all night. Mrs. Henderson was 78 years old and suffered from diabetes. She lived alone in an isolated house at the northern edge of town.
I was already running toward my patrol car when Martinez's next transmission froze me in my tracks.
Sheriff, she says it's still there, standing in her backyard, just standing there, waiting for something. Mrs. Henderson's house sat on 2 acres of pine forest at Whitefall's northern boundary. When I arrived, her porch light created a small island of illumination in the vast ocean of darkness. I parked in the driveway and studied the scene. With growing dread, snow had been disturbed throughout the property, tracks everywhere, as if something had been pacing restlessly for hours.
My radio crackled with static. Sheriff, this is dispatch. Mrs. Henderson isn't responding to phone calls.
I drew my service weapon and approached the front door. It stood slightly ajar. The house was tomb silent. I called out as I moved through each room. Flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Living room, empty. Kitchen, undisturbed. Bathroom, clear. I found Mrs. Henderson in her bedroom. She lay peacefully on the bed, covers pulled up to her chin. For a moment, I thought she might be sleeping. Then I noticed her eyes, wide open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. She wasn't breathing.
No visible wounds. No signs of struggle or violence. She appeared serene, as if she'd simply closed her eyes and drifted into eternal sleep. But her skin was ice cold, far colder than the ambient temperature could explain. It was as if every trace of warmth had been systematically drained from her body.
I checked for vital signs, knowing I'd find none. Mrs. Henderson had been dead for hours, but this was different from the other disappearances. She hadn't been taken. She'd been left behind, like some kind of message. I was calling for the coroner when I heard it. A sound from outside like massive branches breaking, but deeper, more deliberate, almost musical in its rhythm. I moved to the bedroom window and peered into the backyard. Initially, I saw nothing but snow-covered trees and shadows. Then my flashlight beam caught movement near the forest edge. Something stood among the pines, watching the house with predatory patience. It was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, thin enough that it seemed to merge with the surrounding trees. In the darkness, I couldn't discern specific details, but I could make out the general silhouette, humanoid but wrong in every proportion. The arms hung far too low, the head tilted at an angle that violated human anatomy, and it was staring directly at me through the window. I reached for my radio to summon backup, but when I looked up again, the figure had vanished, as if it had never existed at all.
I searched the backyard with my flashlight, finding tracks everywhere but no clear pattern. They seemed to lead in all directions simultaneously, creating a maze of footprints that made no logical sense.
As I prepared to return to the house, my light caught something carved into the bark of the largest pine tree, symbols etched deep into the wood. Not letters or numbers, but marks that resembled claw scratches arranged in deliberate patterns. I photographed the markings and sent them to Mrs. Kowalski. Her response arrived within minutes. Those symbols appear in the oldest native pictographs found in this region. They represent insatiable hunger, endless, consuming need. Standing in Mrs. Henderson's backyard, surrounded by evidence of something that defied explanation, I finally understood what we were confronting.
This wasn't merely a predator. It was something that had been feeding on this community for generations. Something that had learned our patterns, studied our weaknesses, and adapted its hunting methods accordingly.
And now it was running out of patience. Mrs. Henderson's death changed the fundamental nature of our situation. For the first time, the creature had killed someone in their own home instead of taking them. The rules were changing. It was escalating. I spent the morning reviewing everything we knew. 11 victims over 2 months, all suffering from health problems, all taken during the polar night, all except Mrs. Henderson, who'd been left behind like a gruesome calling card. The autopsy results arrived from Fairbanks that afternoon. Mrs. Henderson had died of cardiac arrest, but there were disturbing anomalies. Her body temperature had been abnormally low. Her blood showed signs of severe malnutrition, as if she'd been starving for weeks. But neighbors had seen her the previous day, and she'd appeared perfectly healthy. Whatever had killed her had drained something essential from her body, something more fundamental than just life force. I called an emergency town meeting for that evening. 43 people attended out of our remaining population of 312. The rest were either too terrified to leave their homes or had already fled Whitefall entirely. We're dealing with an unprecedented situation, I announced to the assembled crowd. Something has been systematically targeting specific members of our community until we can identify what it is and develop countermeasures. I'm implementing strict emergency protocols. Nobody travels alone. Nobody leaves their residence after dark. Old Pete Williams raised his gnarled hand. Sheriff, what exactly are we up against here? Because folks are saying it ain't human.
I've been dreading this question. How do you tell rational adults that their neighbors are being hunted by something from their worst nightmares?
We're dealing with an apex predator, I said carefully. Something that's perfectly adapted for hunting in extreme Arctic conditions. It's intelligent, patient, and extremely dangerous. Is it one of those serial killers from down south? Asked Mary Chen, Sarah's younger sister.
No, I said firmly. It's not human.
The room erupted in nervous whispers. Some people laughed uncertainly. Others stared at me with growing horror.
What do you mean? Not human, demanded Jerry Walsh, our mayor.
I pulled out the enhanced photograph from the clinic's surveillance camera. The shadow figure with its impossible anatomy and featureless face. This is what we're confronting.
Absolute silence fell over the room. Several residents stood up and left immediately. Others stared at the image with expressions of pure terror.
That can't be real, Jerry protested, but his voice lacked conviction. It's completely real, I replied, and it's still hunting. After the meeting, only 12 brave souls volunteered for patrol duty. The rest hurried home, constantly checking over their shoulders as they went. That night, I organized the volunteers into teams of 3. Each team would patrol a designated section of town, from sunset to sunrise. We established radio communication protocols and mandatory check-ins every 30 minutes. At 11:15, Team 2 failed to report in. Team 2 consisted of Mike Torres, Janet Walsh, and Bob Chen. I discovered their patrol car abandoned on Maple Street. Engine still running. All 3 doors hanging open. 3 sets of footprints led away from the vehicle toward the forest. But these tracks were different from all the others. Instead of ending abruptly, they continued deep into the woods. For the first time, I had a trail to follow. I summoned Martinez and the remaining volunteers. This is our chance, I told them. We're going after this thing. The trail led us into the dense pine forest north of town. The tracks were easier to follow now. Pressed deep into the snow, 3 sets of human prints, spaced unnaturally wide apart, as if the people were walking in some kind of trance. And alongside them, those larger prints, with the distinctive claw marks. We followed the trail for over 2 miles, through the pitch-black forest. Our flashlights created a small bubble of light in the overwhelming darkness. The only sounds were our labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath our boots. Then Martinez grabbed my arm with iron fingers. Sheriff, look ahead. Through the trees, we could see a faint glow. Not electric light or fire. Something else entirely. Something that flickered with cold blue radiance that seemed to absorb rather than illuminate. We approached with extreme caution, weapons drawn and ready. The light emanated from a clearing, approximately 50 yards ahead. As we drew closer, I detected an odor, not wood smoke or any natural scent, something organic and fundamentally wrong. At the edge of the clearing, I signaled the group to halt. What I observed made my blood turn to ice water. The clearing was perfectly circular, surrounded by towering pines like cathedral pillars. In the center stood a structure constructed entirely of human bones, skulls, ribs, femurs, all arranged in a complex geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. The blue light emanated from symbols carved into the bones themselves. And around this horrific monument, barely visible in the strange radiance, were human figures, sitting in perfect rows like an audience, watching a performance. "Are they?" Martinez whispered. I raised my binoculars for a closer look. The figures were people I recognized from town, men and women who had vanished over the past 2 months. But they weren't moving, weren't breathing. They sat motionless in the snow, staring at nothing with completely empty eyes. I counted 23 figures, every single person who had disappeared. They were all there, all of them, sitting in silent rows around the bone structure, not dead, but not truly alive either. And standing behind them, barely visible in the shadows beyond the blue light, was the thing that had taken them. It was impossibly tall, at least 8 feet in height, possibly more. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, like tree branches twisted by wind and time. Its skin appeared pale and translucent in the eerie blue glow, and its face was human in basic structure, but stretched and distorted beyond recognition, like someone had taken normal human features and pulled them in all directions until they barely resembled their original form. The mouth was far too wide, filled with teeth that gleamed like broken glass. The eyes were completely black, no whites, no iris, no pupil, just empty voids that seemed to devour light itself. But the most disturbing aspect was that I recognized it. Beneath all the monstrous distortion, the face was familiar. I'd seen it in old photographs at the Historical Society. A settler from the 1800s named Thomas Vance. He disappeared during a particularly brutal winter. His body was never recovered. Now I understood why. The creature that had once been Thomas Vance turned its head toward our hiding place among the trees. It smiled, revealing those razor-sharp glass teeth. "Sheriff Webb," it said, and its voice was like Arctic wind through dead branches. "I've been expecting you." I stepped into the clearing, my weapon trained on the abomination. My deputies spread out behind me, trying to flank the creature. "Release them," I commanded. The thing laughed, a sound like breaking ice and dying animals. The sitting figures twitched slightly at the sound, like marionettes responding to their puppeteer's amusement. "Release them," it repeated, mockingly. "But Sheriff, they're exactly where they belong, where they've always belonged." "What are you?" "I'm what this place created," it explained with terrible patience. "What hunger and cold and desperate necessity forged from human weakness. I was like you once, a man trying to survive an impossible winter, but the hunger transformed me into something far superior." It gestured toward the bone structure with one impossibly long arm. "This place calls to those willing to pay the ultimate price, to take whatever they need to survive." "You're murdering innocent people." "I'm feeding it," corrected matter-of-factly. "Just as you feed on weaker animals when you hunt, just as nature intended. The strong consume the weak." The sitting figures began to rise, in perfect unison. Their movements were mechanical, puppet-like. Their eyes remained empty, but they turned toward us with synchronized precision. "They're not dead, Sheriff," the creature explained pleasantly. "They're preserved, kept fresh, until I require sustenance. Would you like to join them?" I opened fire. My bullets passed through the creature as if it were made of mist and shadow. It laughed with cruel delight and gestured to its collection of human puppets. They moved toward us with jerky, unnatural steps. Men and women I'd known for years. Sarah Chen, who had taught my daughter, Jim Morrison, who delivered my mail, all of them walking toward us, with vacant eyes and reaching hands. "Fall back," I shouted to my deputies. We retreated to the tree line, but the controlled people followed relentlessly. They moved slowly but with unwavering purpose. Behind them, the creature watched with those bottomless black holes where its eyes should be.
You cannot fight nature itself, Sheriff, it called out mockingly. You cannot defeat hunger incarnate.
But I'd observed something crucial during our confrontation. The blue light from the bone structure seemed to control the victims. When they moved too far from its influence, they stumbled and became disoriented. The bone structure, I told Martinez urgently. We need to destroy it. She nodded grimly and began working her way around the clearing's perimeter. The controlled people turned to pursue her, creating the opening I needed. I sprinted toward the center of the clearing, toward the horrific monument made of human remains. The creature moved to intercept me, but I was prepared for this moment. I'd brought more than conventional ammunition. In my backpack was a flare gun, loaded with white phosphorus rounds. If this thing was composed of cold and hunger, perhaps fire would prove effective. I fired directly at the creature's torso. The phosphorus round exploded against its chest in a shower of brilliant sparks, and for the first time it screamed. The sound was indescribable, like hurricane winds and shattering ice, and the death cries of 1,000 animals all blended into one horrific note. The creature staggered backward, clawing at the burning wound in its chest. The controlled people stopped moving instantly. Some collapsed to their knees. Others looked around in confusion, as if awakening from a nightmare. I reached the bone structure and pulled out my second phosphorus round. The symbols carved into the human remains pulsed with that cold blue light, fighting against the heat and flame.
No, the creature shrieked in agony. You don't understand what you're doing. Without me, they'll all freeze. They'll all starve. I was protecting them.
I aimed the flare gun directly at the base of the structure. You were feeding on them, I said, and pulled the trigger. The bones exploded in a shower of blue sparks and white-hot phosphorus fire. The unnatural light died instantly, plunging the clearing into normal darkness. Behind me, I heard the creature scream again, but this time, the sound was fading, growing weaker. When I turned around, it was shrinking. The impossible height was collapsing. The stretched features were contracting back toward human proportions. For just a moment, I saw Thomas Vance as he must have been over a century ago, a frightened, desperate man, lost in the wilderness, driven to unthinkable acts by starvation and cold. Then, he was gone, just empty, rotting clothes, collapsing into the snow. The controlled people recovered gradually over the following weeks. Most retained no memory of their captivity. They remembered leaving their homes, then awakening in the forest with no awareness of the time that had passed. The medical experts in Anchorage diagnosed it as traumatic amnesia, a psychological defense mechanism. I knew the truth was far more complex. We never located Mrs. Henderson's remains. She hadn't been among the people in the clearing. I believe the creature had already consumed whatever it needed from her, using her life force completely. The bone structure proved to be far older than anyone had imagined. Carbon dating analysis revealed some of the remains were over 200 years old. Multiple generations of victims, all preserved in that terrible place by forces beyond human understanding. I filed my official report with the state authorities, told them we'd tracked down a survivalist who'd been kidnapping townspeople, said he'd died while resisting arrest. They didn't probe too deeply. Cases like this, they prefer simple explanations that don't challenge their worldview. The sun returned to Whitefall on January 22nd. I'd never been so grateful to see natural daylight, but sometimes, during the coldest nights, I still check my locks multiple times, because I learned something profound in those dark woods. Hunger never truly dies. It simply waits. It adapts. It evolves new methods of survival. And there are places in this world where ancient hungers still roam, still wait for the right conditions, still remember what it feels like to feed on human desperation. The creature that called itself Thomas Vance is gone, but the hunger that created him, that primordial need that transforms men into monsters, that still exists in the deep wilderness, in the endless winter darkness, waiting for the next harsh season, waiting for the next desperate soul, willing to sacrifice everything for survival. If you ever find yourself traveling through remote areas during the darkest months, remember this account. Stay with groups. Keep your doors locked. And if you see something impossibly tall and thin watching you from the tree line,
Don't stop to investigate. Don't try to help.
just run, because some hungers can never be satisfied. They can only be survived. The town of Whitefall struggled to rebuild. After that terrible winter, many families relocated to larger communities where safety seemed more assured. The population dropped from over 300 to fewer than 50 hardy souls who refused to abandon their homes. But even they began noticing troubling signs as the next winter approached. Livestock going missing, strange tracks in the snow, the persistent feeling of being watched from the forest. By November of 2024, Whitefall was completely abandoned. I resigned my position that spring and moved to Phoenix, Arizona. Warm weather, sunshine, crowds of people, everything opposite to that isolated Alaskan town where nightmares walked on two legs. But I still wake up some nights sweating despite the desert heat, remembering those empty black eyes and that voice like breaking ice, remembering the bone structure and the people sitting in silent rows, their humanity drained away by something that should never have existed. I've spent months researching similar incidents across Alaska, northern Canada, Siberia, places where winter lasts too long and civilization grows thin. The pattern repeats itself throughout history. During the harshest seasons, people disappear, official explanations are offered, then silence, until the cycle begins again. The hunger is patient. It can wait decades between feedings, but it never truly dies. Last week, I received a call from a sheriff in northern Minnesota, a small town called Frost Lake, population 237. He'd found my contact information in some old case files. Sheriff Webb, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. We've had 6 people disappear in the past month. Always the same way. Vehicles running, doors open, no tracks, and the strangest thing, they all had health problems. I told him I couldn't help, told him to contact the state authorities, told him I was retired. But I've been watching the weather reports from Minnesota, early winter, record-breaking cold, the polar vortex pushing far south of its normal range. The conditions are perfect. The hunger is stirring again.
I should stay here in Phoenix. Should mind my own business. Should let someone else deal with whatever is awakening in the Minnesota woods.
But I can't forget those 23 people sitting in perfect rows around that bone structure. Can't forget Mrs. Henderson lying cold and empty in her bed. Can't forget the sound of that creature's laughter echoing through the darkness. Tomorrow, I'm driving north. Maybe I can't kill something that was never truly alive. Maybe I can't stop the hunger entirely. But maybe I can save a few people from becoming the next collection of silent puppets in the snow. Maybe that's enough. The hunger that walks is ancient and patient. It has survived ice ages and the rise and fall of civilizations. It will outlive me, and probably outlive humanity itself. But every person saved is a victory. Every town that survives the winter is a triumph. even if the victory is only temporary, even if the hunger always returns. Because in the end, that's what makes us human, not our strength or our intelligence or our technology, but our willingness to stand against the darkness, even when we know we cannot win. Especially when we know we cannot win. The road to Minnesota is long and cold, but somewhere ahead, people are disappearing, families are being torn apart, a community is being systematically hunted by something that feeds on human suffering. And I'm the only one who knows what they're really facing, the only one who might be able to help them survive until spring. I've loaded my truck with phosphorus flares, cameras, and everything I learned from that terrible winter in Whitefall. It probably won't be enough. It's never enough. But I have to try, because that's what the badge meant. Even after I took it off, protect and serve, stand between the innocent and the monsters. Even when the monsters are things that shouldn't exist. Even when the darkness seems endless.
Even when hope feels like the cruelest lie of all.
The hunger that walks is patient and eternal, but so is the human spirit. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, that's enough to keep the darkness at bay, at least until morning comes. Sheriff Marcus Webb was found dead in his truck on Highway 35 in northern Minnesota on December 3rd, 2024. The vehicle had run out of gas, approximately 50 miles south of Frost Lake. The doors were open. There were no tracks in the snow. His final journal entry, discovered in the truck, contained detailed plans for confronting what he called an ancient predator. The entry ended mid-sentence. Frost Lake was evacuated 2 days later due to what authorities described as unusual wildlife activity. The town remains abandoned. If you are currently living in a remote northern community and have experienced similar disappearances, especially during winter months, document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that some threats cannot be fought with conventional methods, but they can sometimes be survived. Stay safe, stay together, and never stop fighting the darkness.